America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker with the Job Creators Network. And today we are joined by Breitbart's John Carney. John is the economics and finance editor at Breitbart, and of course, the author of Breitbart Business Digest. And if you are not subscribed to it, you need to, because we are going to talk about some breaking news. And that is the BLS just announced the downward jobs revision for the last 12 months from March of 24 to end of March of 25. The jobs revision is down 911,000 jobs. That is a huge, huge blow. What's your thought, John?
So what this tells us is that the Trump administration came into office with a far weaker economy than we thought. Almost 1 million jobs, 911,000 jobs, works out to about 76,000 fewer jobs on average per month from March of 2024 through March of 2025. The economy was just not creating jobs at the pace that it appeared to be, which means that basically that a lot of our economic policies, particularly those coming from the Fed, are way off base. The economy has been weaker than we thought, and it has been teetering on the edge. I mean, 76,000 is barely enough to keep the job creation in line with the population growth. So that, we're barely staying above water is what that tells us.
But I mean, it makes sense when you think about through the Biden administration, the level of inflation went all the way up to over 9% inflation, and overall prices were elevated about 22%. I mean, they're still elevated from the pre-Biden administration, really. I mean, prices are still elevated, although the inflation rate has come down. We still are paying, more for a lot of things. And we probably will always, it's probably never going to come back to, pre-COVID levels. But it makes sense that the job creation was not what we thought. And maybe there is, some truth to how, to Trump firing the head of the BLS and how they calculated the numbers. And maybe it's not that person's fault. I don't recall her name right now, but maybe it's not her fault. Because that is the formula. That is the way they've always done it, as they say. But it means we need to take a look at all of those things going into the inputs of how these jobs are calculated, because these are massive revisions.
Yeah, that's right. This is a massive revision. So just so everybody knows, every year they do a revision. And one of the things they try to do is figure out better. The monthly estimates come out and they get revised twice. What they try to do every year is look back through all the businesses that were created and all the businesses that closed during the year and try to get a better sense for what really happened. You can't do that in real time. So they do this big revision. And this is the initial, they call it the preliminary estimate for the jobs, for the employment situation revision. What this means is that we were creating far fewer jobs. In a weird way, this shows us that actually Fed monetary policy was working in a way that it didn't seem to be last year, which means when the Fed raises interest rates, you would expect there to be less job creation. That's one of the ways that the higher interest rates work. And so when the Fed was running these, had interest rates all the way up 5.25%, you should have had less job creation. It was surprising to a lot of economists, actually, that we seemed to be creating as many jobs as we were. What this is telling us is actually we weren't. The job creation was a lot less than we thought. Monetary policy was being more effective in terms of holding down job creation. It also, it was bringing down inflation. So it's not just doing harm to the economy. It was bringing down inflation as well. But the weight on the labor market was far greater than what we thought, principally because it makes it harder to run a business. It makes any expansion, you're usually borrowing money to do that. It makes it more expensive to expand your business, so you hire fewer people. That's what this number is telling us. It also tells us that that's probably happening right now, that the weight of high interest rates that the Fed has kept in place, they haven't changed them this year at all, is probably weighing down the labor market, holding down job creation far more than people actually understand. And that Trump inherited a much weaker labor market. People, I remember saying, why are people so upset about the economy under Biden? It's doing great. Remember, there was this whole narrative, right? Like, people have lost their mind. The economy is actually doing well. And the consumer surveys kept showing, and all the polls kept showing, people were unhappy with the economy. Well, it turns out that the official numbers were wrong and the people were right. The economy was weaker than it thought. The labor market in particular was not booming. Growth was tailing off. We got like 1.8% growth at the end of the year. So growth was falling, job creation was falling, and the weight of interest rates was really slowing down the economy. That's what this revision is telling us. We'll get another version of this revision in January, and it will tell us whether this number it could go up or down from this. 9/11 is not the total number, the absolute highest number. It could get revised up. Last year, they came up with a 800 and something thousand, and it got revised down a little in January. So we'll get the final numbers in a couple months from now.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about what we've talked about over the last year, with the jobs market. And every month when the jobs numbers would come out under Biden, I thought, man, he is the luckiest so-and-so.
Yeah.
It drove me insane because I thought, how is this possible? Well, the reality is it wasn't. But, we've been calling, what did you call the Fed? A data denier when you were on last time. You called them a data denier because all the data was pointing to cut the rates, cut the rates, cut the rates. And he kept saying, obviously resisting because he is anticipating inflation from the tariffs, which we continue to really not see. On the other hand, there was a piece of data that he wasn't getting, that wasn't accurate. And so that really calls into question, once again, how our government functions in terms of the data that they put out. And it's at a point where it's like, what can we trust? And you can't just say, well, let's trust it when it's good for us. I mean, we have to look at it in terms of no matter what, we have to look at how do we trust it?
They've had a serious problem that's been getting worse for a couple of years now, which is the response rate for the surveys that they send out to businesses to create the jobs numbers has been falling. It used to be in like August, for instance, I think it used to be in the high 70s, meaning 70% of the businesses that they asked, hey, how many people do you employ right now, were responding. This past August, it was down in the 50s. It was 57% or so. So they've had a huge fall off in the response rate. We're not quite sure why that is. There may be many reasons. Somebody told me that, look, some of the companies are still expected to fax in the responses. If that's true, I can't confirm that. I hope that isn't what the case is, because that would be crazy. But what they should have been doing for the last couple of years is figuring out a solution to this, not just letting the quality of the data deteriorate, but done what a business would do, right? If you were doing consumer surveys and you found out that your customer surveys were wrong, you would say, okay, how do we fix this? So they really should have been trying to figure out what do we do to get the response rate back up? Are we making it too hard? Do people not trust that the government is going to keep this confidential? What is driving the low response rate? I do think that maybe some of it may be the confidential part. I know I've talked to businessmen who have said that they're worried that when they send in data that it may get shared elsewhere in the government. This is sort of I think during the pandemic, a lot of distrust in institutions grew up, and I think we're still seeing that. But they need to figure out a way to fix it. You shouldn't have revisions this large. And you shouldn't, even the monthly revisions, frankly, every month this year, the final revision, so they do it twice, the final revision has been lower than the preliminary revision. That's a systematic error. Now, normally you would expect, sometimes you get it higher, sometimes you get it lower, it goes up and down. When you're getting all the errors in one direction, you're overestimating the amount of jobs month after month after month. That's a problem. That shouldn't be happening every time. It's a systematic error that should be able to be corrected. I know Trump firing the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics was controversial, but she, at least as far as I can tell, hadn't done anything to address these problems. And if she wasn't doing anything to address the problem, she should have been fired. She has been fired now, and I'm sure that Trump's next, he's appointed E.J. Antoni. I'm sure he will act very quickly to try to address the quality of the data once he's confirmed.
Well, we saw revisions every month just under Biden,
right,
just like we're seeing under Trump. And they were monthly, very large revisions where it'd be this big headline number and the press would tout, oh, Bidenomics is working. It's fantastic. Da, da, da. And then the next month we'd see this massive revision. No one would talk about it. So I know it's no surprise to you. But the media talks about incessantly the revisions. They're as big a headlines as anything else. All the
that's right. They decided suddenly when the revisions looked bad for Trump that now the revisions matter. Before they paid no attention. They also try to excuse the revisions, which is they say, well, you can't blame the BLS because it always gets revised. That's true. But the revisions have been especially large and they have been especially unidirectional, which is, again, a problem. It should, if it's random error, it should go up and down. If it's systemic error, then it goes in one direction. And that's what we've been seeing. So the BLS should be doing a better job. Now, look, I don't even want to insult the BLS that much. The people who work at the BLS, I know some of them, they're really good and they try really hard. They do the best with all the tools they get. I want to discourage people from thinking that they're rigging the numbers. They're not. All the tools they have, they do the best they can, but they actually need leadership from the top to actually either lobby for more funding, lobby for new ways to be able to do these surveys. They need to be able to correct this. You can't do that if you are the guy whose job it is to, compile Michigan's data. That's above your pay grade. It's the people at the top who need to fix it. I do think that it creates huge hazards, though, because as you were saying, the Fed makes policy off of the data it has. And if the data and so does the rest of our government. And if the data we have is wrong, then policy will be wrong. And so I think almost inarguably looking at this data, the Fed was too tight last year, too tight right now. If they had this data, I don't think interest rates would be where they are because they would have seen that job creation was much more sluggish than they thought. I think this, definitely when the Fed meets next week, they're going to cut now. I mean, they're going to look at this and say, that was probably already baked in, but they may now also have to say, well, we're not just cutting at this September meeting. We have one in October and we have one in December. We're going to cut in subsequent meetings as well.
Do you think the quarter point that's been discussed is going to be enough in this
I don't. I think that they should cut by a half a point, 50 basis points. I doubt they'll do that. We may get, depending on what happens with the inflation numbers that are coming out, if those come in weaker than expected, maybe we get the half point cut. If they come in stronger than expected, definitely not a half point cut. So, but I think Jerome Powell has been very reluctant to cut rates because he is absolutely convinced of something that there's no evidence for, which is that tariffs will cause inflation. And what's very frustrating to me, at least, is when tariffs don't cause inflation, Jerome Powell doesn't say, oh, I guess I was wrong. What he says is, well, it's just coming. It just isn't here yet, right? I'm still right, even though all the evidence points in the opposite direction. We just saw, I just read headlines about Temu losing market share in the U.S. because of tariffs, so they're dropping their prices. The NFIB's survey of small businesses shows that that fewer businesses than since the beginning of the year are raising prices. So this idea of pass through, that tariffs were going to be, hiking prices, I thought it would hike prices a little bit once off. We're not even seeing what I thought would happen. It's just not coming through in the prices of goods. And so Powell should back off of that view. I don't think he's going to. He's going to stick to it. So they'll do a quarter point cut and probably signal that they need to see how that plays out in future months before they commit to even more cuts.
So we're both in agreement then that there was enough data before this today to lower interest rates. And if the Fed needed more, he's got a lot more as of right now to justify a rate cut so that he doesn't look like he's trying to purposely help Donald Trump in any way, shape, or form.
That's right. I think any normal policymaker in this situation, first of all, I think normal policy would have been cut back much earlier this year. But given what we just saw, this giant downward revision in jobs creation, I think they now would any central banker worth its salt would come in and cut right now. Because again, it gives him a little cover. He can say, well, look, I just didn't, and it's true. He didn't know. He did not know that we had 911,000 fewer jobs over from March to March. And I think that's important because you're going to see headlines that are going to say, under Trump, the jobs economy is much worse than we thought, right? This is mostly under Biden. This is a March to March revision. So March 2004 to March 2005. March 2024 to March 2025. And so, Donald Trump took office at the end of January, and so he was barely president for 2 months by the time during this revision. Most of all the jobs that are being taken away are jobs that we thought were created under Biden.
Yeah, exactly. So we have new polling in from our small business owners. We do a national poll, and we asked small business owners, how are you going to take advantage of the provisions of the new tax bill, the big, beautiful bill? 91%. I think that takes away any level of partisanship when you see a number like 91% of small business owners plan to increase wages, expand their operations, hire new employees, buy new equipment because of all of those provisions that were made permanent, like the immediate expensing and the 20% pass through. They plan to take advantage of them. But the high interest rates have been really putting a lot of pressure on those small business owners to actually leverage those benefits. And so I think that we really have, but there's a lot of optimism. In terms of like how small business owners are feeling, they are optimistic about their own personal situation. They are optimistic about the current economy and the future of the economy. And that tells me that if the Fed does lower interest rates, particularly multiple times, as you just mentioned, potential other cuts this year, that we have a chance to really see an economy pick up in a big way.
I think that's right. I think that we have a chance to get Right now, the tax provisions from the One Big Beautiful Bill are, and I guess it's the One Big Beautiful Act now, are the One Big Beautiful Law is are kicking into the economy, as you said. Businesses are getting to now take advantage of the full depreciation, and so we are going to see more investment. We should see for consumers, we're going to get the tax breaks for no taxes on Social Security, no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime. So that should re-energize the consumer side. We get the business side. And if you add to that, cutting the interest rate, that should be a powerful spur to revitalize the economy in the months going forward. So I'm actually, despite this bad news that we had about how the economy was doing through March and probably how it was doing, it didn't stop doing badly in March. We probably, the drag that we saw probably continued. But I think that, the Trump tax cuts and the Fed interest rate cuts that are coming will actually help spark. I'm pretty optimistic about the rest of this year and especially next year. We should have a pretty strong economy.
Which I think if the Republicans can really talk about this bill, what'd you call it? The One Big Beautiful Act?
One Big Beautiful Law, I think now.
I can't get away from calling it the One Big Beautiful
Bill.
If they can really talk about it in terms of the positive nature of the elements that are in it and bring to light real stories that Americans can relate to. I mean, we have, just off the top of my head, I can think of two small business owners. One's in Illinois, not exactly a state that is, has pro-growth policies, but she's a small manufacturer. She's got about 35 employees. She plans to buy a piece of equipment that's about $650,000, hire 5 people to run it. I mean, right there, multiply that by tens of thousands of small business owners doing the same thing. I mean, you've got an economy taking off. I've got another restaurant owner in South Florida, plans to open 2 new restaurants and hire 100 people. I mean, again, multiply that by tens of thousands, if not millions of small business owners across the country making those kinds of moves. Yeah, over the next 12 to 24 months, we could really see some great things happen. But the Republicans need to talk about it in those terms.
Absolutely. One thing I think there does also need to be a lot of education. Remember, a lot of people who run, and you guys are great at this, by the way, but a lot of people who run businesses, their time is taken up running their business. They don't necessarily know that everything that was in the tax bill that can benefit them. And so as they learn this, I think we'll see even more investment. And we're actually seeing that in some of the economic statistics. If you look in the durable goods orders for things like capital equipment orders, those are actually doing very well. And so what that tells you is that, yes, businesses are saying, okay, I now know I can invest. I will be able to get the tax benefit from the depreciation. Now it's not going to have to be stretched out over 7 years. And that's a big advantage. It makes things more affordable. And if you do lower the interest rates, so the borrowing costs go down, then you can really spark a pretty big investment boom. I think that's going to come. And as you were just pointing out, the investment boom then leads to an employment boom because you buy new equipment, you open new plants, you open a new restaurant. You then also need to hire the people to run those things. So you get a productivity increase, you get an employment increase, and you get this investment increase. That is the recipe for a economy that does very well. So all the parts are almost in place. We do need those interest rate cuts. I think we're going to get them. They're almost in place. But it does, I think it's really important to, when you see headlines about how the labor market is doing, to remember labor market was weaker when Trump came in, and the weight of the Fed's interest rate policy was much stronger than anybody thought. It was really weighing down employment in a way that we didn't understand right up until Tuesday morning.
Yeah. I think you're probably the only person who's going to say, and the Fed's policy was actually working better than we thought last year.
It was, I will at least say that it was, better, worse. Let's just say that the Fed policy was was stronger than we thought, right? That it had a greater weight on the economy. Now, as I said, that probably helped bring down inflation further than it otherwise would have. Because obviously when people don't have jobs, they're not spending as much. That can bring down inflation. But the negative side of it was the job creation was a lot less robust than it would have been. And by the way, that I don't think it was just Fed policy that weighed on it. Remember, a lot of people up until, really August and that when it became clear that Joe Biden could not be president again. And a lot of people said, okay, Donald Trump's going to get reelected. I think a lot of businesses were very worried about the future, and they probably held back on expanding and hiring because they said, all right, look, I saw what happened with regulation, with all of the requirements that were being put on my business every day. That's only going to get worse in a second Biden term when he doesn't have to worry about getting reelected. Imagine if he did this working into the election, what will happen next? I think we actually started to get some relief from the fear of a second Biden term when he had that disastrous debate where everybody said, okay, that's it. No more Biden. Kamala Harris really never became a credible candidate again. That also provided relief. So I imagine the businesses started to feel some relief from what looked like the unending growth of the regulatory state and the regulatory weight on business beginning in August 2014. But Trump getting elected then provided the next leg of that where people said, okay, good, right? Like we don't have to worry about the never-ending mounting of regulation and higher taxes. But Joe Biden was threatening, remember, they were going to raise taxes on every business, every small business, they're all pass-throughs, that earned over $400,000 a year. That was a tax hike on all the small businesses in America. And he was threatening that. His loss actually in itself, I think, provided economic stimulus to the country because people said, okay, good. I no longer have to fear that tax hike coming from Biden. Trump's not going to do it, and he hasn't.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. I wanted to ask you before we go, we see this continued surge in Mandami running for mayor up in New York. There was a poll that came out yesterday on the increase of support in socialism, decrease in support of capitalism. What are your thoughts on what's happening in New York? I mean, I've heard some people say they deserve what they vote for. They totally deserve it. But my gosh, when you hear him talk about creating the Department of Community Safety,
right? No more police, right?
He's not going to cut anything from the police. Department of Community Safety, and he's going to raise the funds for it through taxing business, and he just calls it the top 1%, but those are many times the job creators, particularly in a city like that. And they're going to raise $1 billion. They don't need to cut anything in their budget anywhere. There's no waste in New York City. I just want you to know that. What are your thoughts on that direction of Americans moving more and more towards socialism and something like that continuing to surge?
Right. Well, so I am a native New Yorker, and this is my hometown. And I spend a lot of time in New York City. So I take it very personally. And I actually think of of New York City as America's city in many ways. It was the first capital of the United States. Americans from all over the country come to visit New York, if not every year, a couple times in their life. They come to see Broadway shows. They like the Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Central Park. This is all of American City. I used to say that we New Yorkers only have stewardship over this city. It's actually America's city. So I don't like it when, people say, oh, well, they get what they deserve. Maybe New Yorkers are getting what they deserve, but the rest of America doesn't deserve what's going to happen to New York. They don't get a vote in it. The stewards of New York, meaning the residents, are actually letting down the country if they elect this socialist mayor. What's driving this? So I actually wrote an article about this for American Compass, where I argued that there's a couple things driving it. One is just there's actually a lot of dissatisfaction among young professionals in America. The economy has not been performing as well for them as they had hoped, as it should have been. A huge part of this is actually the outsourcing of a lot of their jobs to abroad, the importing of a lot of people through various visa programs. And so you have these people in New York who on paper look very successful. They've got, a job at a big company based in New York City. They're earning what would be a lot of money anywhere else in the world, but also anywhere else in America, except perhaps San Francisco and Washington, D.C. They can barely make ends meet. So they feel that capitalism has failed them. Now, of course, I think they're wrong about what exactly has failed them, but I understand what they're pointing to, which is the economy has not performed as well for them as it should have. I think they're going to learn a lesson that this is a mistaken path to go on, but I don't think they have a very good I think they may have to learn that lesson. New York has done this before. I grew up in the 1970s and 80s in New York City, and it was not the city it became in the 90s and 2000s when we overcame crime. It was crime-ridden. The subways were covered in graffiti and dirt and crime. People were afraid to go out. People used to carry around some extra money in their pockets, so when they got robbed, they could give that to the mugger rather than have to give their wallet up to them. If you got mugged, people just thought that was, we're sort of seeing that from mayors around America now. When confronted about crime in their city, they say things like, well, what do you expect? It's a big city. That's a really disgusting way of looking at things. I think one of the things people like about Mamdani, frankly, is he's giving a different answer, which is that life can be better in the city. He's not saying what the normal liberal Democrats are saying in places like Chicago, where they just say, oh, life's tough in a big city, grow up, right? He's saying you could have a better life. I think his program for generating the better life is extremely wrong, but it does show that hope. I think Donald Trump runs on hope, and he gets elected because he says, no, you don't have to, things can be better. Your lives can be better. The government can actually have better policies that will help improve things. Mamdani is giving a very similar message in terms of we can have a brighter future. His policies are exactly wrong, and I think they're going to generate a disaster. If he follows those. I have, maybe I'm just too hopeful, but I maybe too prayerful, but I say, maybe when he gets elected, he'll change his tune, adopt something more sensible. Probably not. Maybe New York has to learn the lesson that socialism and not enforcing the law against criminals will lead to disaster. But I do think what's driving it is he's fundamentally giving a message of hope, where the other Democrats who he defeated in the primary were giving a lesson of oh, come on, grow up. You just have to deal with crime and homelessness and dirt and fear and poor schools and expensive rent. They weren't offering any solutions. He did. So I think that's why he's probably going to get elected mayor.
Well, you mentioned younger people really being dissatisfied with how our system has failed them, in spite of the fact that they may have good jobs and even good paying jobs. There just seem to not be enough. One of the things that I have talked to some millennials about is the housing crisis,
right,
and their ability to buy their first home and have the American dream. There's just this growing divide between the Gen Xers, and older generations, and the millennials and new younger generations are unable to purchase their homes. Inflation in housing housing has far exceeded inflation for the last half century.
Right.
And then you add in higher interest rates, and just overall inflation, particularly it feels like since COVID, it feels like things were somewhat normal and attainable prior to COVID. I think the average cost of housing of a house was about $200,000. A year or two ago, I read that it was about $400,000. It's probably higher now. How does I think the president's going to declare a housing emergency, a state of housing emergency, and kind of try to address some of these issues through I don't want to say nationalize, but standardizing building permitting and zoning laws. How do they do that when those are such local issues?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. Housing is a huge part of this. It's not just buying houses, by the way. It's also rent is really high in some of our big cities. New York City, extraordinarily high. And so what can be done about this? And the other thing I'll say is people tend to compare themselves to the generation that came before them, whether it's their parents' generation or even just their older cousins' generation. And so what millennials or Gen Zers do is look at the interest rates that people in my generation were able to get, frankly, because we had this financial crisis and interest rates plummeted. And they say, man, those guys were able to buy a house and pay 4% on their mortgage or lower. Some of us have mortgages lower than 3%. And they're asked to pay 6 to 7%. So they feel like, and this just happens throughout history, it's a well-known economic fact, that when you feel like you have a worse deal than the generation that came before you, even if historically, look, 7% interest, if you ask my parents, they would say, we would have killed for 7% interest. But that's not the way the mind works, right? It looks back to what we just had and says, why are things worse for me now? So the national housing emergency is interesting. They're trying to work out what will this mean? What can they do? They don't want to nationalize zoning because there's, as you said, it's very local and there's very good reasons why in local areas you want different rules. One rule across the country for what you can build would be a disaster. However, there's probably emergency relief to even federal regulation that gets in the way of building more houses. There's a lot of environmental regulation that goes into trying to construct new houses, then trying to open up new land to housing that we could provide some relief through, once you declare just under a lot of statutes, once the president declares an emergency, you can provide at least temporary relief to things like regulation. So I don't think they're going to try to overwhelm or overcome local zoning rules. I do think what they'll try to do is perhaps provide some tax incentives to make it easier to build, and then also provide regulatory relief to make it easier to build and easier to open up new land. Right now, in a lot of places, if you try to open up, a heretofore piece of farmland or just wilderness into housing, you will run into almost just a wall of regulation that will say, no, if you increase density there, you will increase emissions, you'll increase water usage. It becomes very difficult. If we provide relief to that, I think it will help in housing, but unfortunately, not immediately. It takes time to build houses. We probably have a pretty big housing shortage. So it'll take time to get past that. But at least I think with the national housing emergency, to get back to what we were saying about Mandami, people are tired of hearing just suck it up. It's, like life is tough. You don't, oh, poor babies can't own a house, especially from those of us who own a house, right? Like if I say to somebody, whoa, no, oh, you got to live in an apartment. And I can say, yeah, I lived in an apartment. I rented for years, but I own a house. So it's really, I think by declaring a national housing emergency, Trump is tapping back into that idea that we do not have to accept a life in which our economy doesn't perform, doesn't serve us, that we can actually make changes. And so, it's a message of hope. I think that's what they're trying to tap into with the housing emergency.
Well, I hope they find a way, because I have young kids, 20-something kids. Obviously, they want to own their first home. And I don't know how they can stare at, coming up with qualifying
Incredible.
for a $450,000 house or $500,000 house in your first entry-level jobs that, oh, by the way, AI could possibly take over and you won't be able to get that job anyway.
Yeah, and look, you're trying to save up money when your rent is really high already, when you owe, you have student loans. Student loans are also linked to what the Fed's interest rate policy are. So your student loan interest rate has gone up. Your rent is very high because of the housing shortage, and you're trying to save up for homes that keep going up every month. You can see where the desperation comes from. I think you're right. People in their 20s probably look with despair at the possibility of owning a house. If Donald Trump can address that, and I think he can, that'd be a huge psychological boost to a lot of Americans. And I think a huge political boost. Donald Trump is probably not going to run for president again. He's been president twice. We would need a constitutional amendment. But to J.D. Vance or whoever the next Republican nominee, if the Republicans are seen as the party that is really addressing the housing crisis, while the Democrats, mayors tell them, oh, just live with crime and filth, you'll grow up.
Well, I still think it goes back to how Republicans and conservatives talk about the one big beautiful law. Trump does a great job talking about it. I think he could do a great job talking about some of those issues related to housing affordability as well. I think Secretary Bessent does a fantastic job. I love listening to him because he really speaks in real language and connects it to everyday Americans and their struggles. And he needs to give lessons on how to talk about it. He and Trump together could give lessons on how to connect it back to everyday ordinary Americans, these policies, so that they can see the dots connect across the board on how you could benefit from X policy.
We haven't had a Treasury Secretary that is as great of a communicator as Scott Bessent since Alexander Hamilton. He is, I think, the best Treasury Secretary since the founding of the Republic. And I really do hope that whatever the housing policy that the Trump administration comes out with, that they really do give Secretary Bessent a lead role in this. Because as you said, I think he's just fantastic at communicating the goals and the policies of the administration when it comes to this stuff.
I agree. I could not agree more. But on housing, I think you and I both agree, if the rates get cut, at least the mortgage rates will come down and it'll help some people afford a house.
Yes.
Probably not everybody, but some people will be able to afford a house that maybe couldn't last month. So hopefully that happens. John, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I love talking to you about this stuff. Let's see what happens. We'll regroup after the Fed makes his announcement. And thank you all for taking the time to tune in to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast from, and we'll be back soon with another episode. Bye for now.